The morning sun filtered through the leaves of the tall oak trees lining the entrance to Crestwood High School. Marcus adjusted the straps of his backpack, inhaling deeply as he stood before the grand iron gates. It was his first day at the prestigious school, a place known for producing leaders, innovators and world changers. To Marcus this felt like the start of a new chapter, one filled with possibilities. He smiled to himself, trying to shake off the nervous energy buzzing through him. "All right, Marcus," he muttered under his breath, summoning courage. "New school, new opportunities. You've got this." The sharp sound of the bell rang out in the distance, signaling the beginning of a new academic year. Students poured through the gates in clusters, their voices blending into a symphony of chatter and laughter. Marcus watched them for a moment, taking in the confident strides, the warm hugs exchanged between old friends, and the animated recounting of summer adventures. He wasn't like them, not yet. Marcus was new here, a transfer student navigating uncharted territory. Still, he felt determined to make this his own. He had always been the kind of person to see potential everywhere, even in the unknown. The campus stretched out before him, a mix of old-world charm and modern sophistication. Ivy climbed the walls of Gothic-style buildings, while large windows glistened in the sunlight. Marcus had read about Crestwood's reputation, a school known for its rigorous academics, cutting-edge programs and a culture of excellence. It was a place where ambition thrived, and Marcus was ready to join its ranks. As he stepped onto the cobblestone path leading to the main building, he reminded himself why he was here. Ever since he was a kid, Marcus had been fascinated by how things worked. He'd spent countless afternoons disassembling broken radios, piecing together model cars, and sketching designs for inventions in his notebook. Becoming an engineer wasn't just a dream for Marcus, it was a calling. Crestwood, with its advanced STEM curriculum and well-connected alumni network, was his stepping stone to that future. The path forward wouldn't be easy though. Unlike most of his peers, Marcus didn't come from privilege. His family had worked hard to give him this opportunity, and he carried the weight of their sacrifices on his shoulders. He had to succeed, not just for himself but for them. Marcus also carried another piece of his identity quietly. His father, Mr. Johnson, was Crestwood's new principal. It was a fact Marcus preferred to keep to himself. He wanted to prove his worth based on his own merit, not because of his family connection. The last thing he wanted was for people to see him as the principal's kid. Walking into the main building, Marcus felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. The hallways bustled with students moving purposefully from one place to another. The walls were lined with bulletin boards announcing debate club tryouts, student council elections, and upcoming sports events. Everything about Crestwood felt larger than life, a world of opportunities, but also a stage where everyone seemed to be performing at their peak. Clutching his schedule, Marcus glanced at the first entry. First period, History, Room 204. History had always been a subject Marcus enjoyed. He loved connecting the dots between past events and the present, understanding how decisions made centuries ago still shape the world today. He had heard that the history teacher, Ms. Holloway, was known for her challenging classes. According to the school website, she pushed her students hard but was deeply committed to their success. Marcus was eager to see for himself. The door to room 204 was slightly ajar. Inside, the classroom felt different from the rest of the school. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old leather-bound books and framed portraits of historical figures gazing sternly into the room. The front desk was immaculate, with papers stacked neatly and a single red pen placed precisely in the center. Marcus chose a seat in the middle, unpacking his notebook and pen as other students filed in. The chatter around him was muted, almost as though the room's atmosphere demanded a quieter tone. He noticed a few students whispering and exchanging glances toward the front of the room, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Then she walked in. Miss Holloway strode through the door with an air of authority that silenced the room immediately. She was tall and composed, her sharp features framed by neatly tied back hair. Her eyes, cool and piercing, swept across the classroom like a spotlight. She carried a stack of papers under one arm and a leather-bound notebook under the other. "Good morning, class," she said, her voice clipped and formal. "Welcome to history. I hope you're ready to work because this is not a class for slackers." Her tone set the tone for the room, serious, no-nonsense, and intimidating. She scanned the room, her gaze pausing briefly on Marcus before moving on. Marcus straightened in his seat, unsure of why her eyes lingered on him, but he quickly brushed it off. Ms. Holloway wasted no time diving into the syllabus. She outlined a challenging curriculum packed with essays, presentations, and a group project that would account for a significant portion of their grade. Marcus scribbled notes furiously, eager to stay ahead. When a student near the front raised their hand to ask a question about the group project, Ms. Holloway's response was curt. "You'll find all the details in the syllabus," she said without looking up. "Read it?" Marcus could feel the tension in the room grow heavier. He'd had strict teachers before, but there was something about Ms. Holloway that felt particularly unsettling. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Marcus felt both relieved and curious about what lay ahead. But just as he was packing his things, Ms. Holloway's voice cut through the chatter. "Mr. Johnson," she called out. Marcus froze, his heart skipping a beat. He turned slowly to face her. "Yes, ma'am?" She walked toward him, her heels clicking against the tiled floor with precision. "Your name, it sounds familiar," she said, her tone measured. "Are you related to the new principal?" Marcus hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes, ma'am. He's my father." Miss Holloway's lips pressed into a thin line, her expression unreadable. "I see," she said, her voice cooling even further. "Well, I hope you understand that I don't play favorites. If anything, I'll expect more from you." Marcus nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am. I wouldn't expect anything less." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she turned and walked back to her desk. Marcus left the classroom, a strange feeling settling in his chest. Her words hadn't been overtly hostile, but there was something in her tone that made him uneasy. By the time Marcus got home that evening, he was exhausted but determined to stay positive. Over dinner, he told his father about his classes, highlighting how excited he was to dive into history, even if Ms. Holloway seemed a little intense. Mr. Johnson smiled warmly, placing a reassuring hand on Marcus' shoulder. "You're going to do great, son. Just stay focused and remember, if you ever need help, I'm here." Marcus nodded, grateful for his father's encouragement but determined to handle things on his own. He wanted to prove himself at Crestwood, not as the principal's son, but as Marcus Johnson, a student who earned his success through hard work and determination. As he lay in bed that night, Marcus replayed the day in his mind. Miss Holloway's sharp words echoed faintly, but he pushed them aside. Tomorrow's a new day, he thought to himself. Little did he know, his optimism would soon be tested in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Ms. Holloway was a fixture at Crestwood High School, a teacher whose reputation preceded her. She had been teaching history for over a decade, and her name carried weight in the school's hallowed halls. Known for her high standards and no-nonsense approach, students often said her class was one of the hardest but most rewarding. Teachers admired her for her meticulous lesson plans, and parents praised her for challenging their children to excel. But there was another side to Ms. Holloway that only her students truly knew, a side hidden beneath the veneer of professionalism. Marcus had heard about her before his first day at Crestwood. Other students described her as tough but fair, a teacher who didn't tolerate laziness. Marcus liked a challenge, so he walked into room 204 on that first day ready to learn, ready to prove himself. But from the moment Ms. Holloway laid eyes on him, Marcus sensed that something was off. When she took attendance and reached his name, her gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary. Her sharp eyes narrowed, scanning him as though she were sizing him up. "Marcus Johnson," she said, her tone flat. Marcus nodded politely. "Present," he replied. Ms. Holloway didn't respond immediately. Instead, she paused as if rolling his name over in her mind. Then, without a word, she continued down the list. The moment was brief, but it left an impression on Marcus. He brushed it off at first, attributing her demeanor to nerves or the stress of the first day. But as the days turned into weeks, Marcus realized there was something deeper at play. The first real confrontation happened during a discussion about the Industrial Revolution. Ms. Holloway had posed a question to the class. What were the long-term social impacts of industrialization? Marcus, eager to participate, raised his hand. When she called on him, he spoke confidently. "I think industrialization widened the gap between the rich and the poor. While it created jobs, it also led to poor working conditions and exploitation, especially for children." Before he could finish, Ms. Holloway interrupted. "That's a simplistic view, Marcus," she said, her voice laced with condescension. "You probably don't even know what you're talking about. Perhaps you should read more before you offer an opinion." The words landed like a slap. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he forced a smile and nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. The room was silent. A few of his classmates glanced at him with sympathy, but most kept their eyes fixed on their desks. Ms. Holloway moved on as though nothing had happened, but Marcus couldn't shake the sting of her words. He replayed the moment in his head later that evening, questioning whether his response had truly been inadequate. But when he reviewed his notes and looked up additional sources, he realized his answer had been accurate. Ms. Holloway's dismissal hadn't been about the content of his response. It had been about him. Over time the pattern became clear. Ms. Holloway called on Marcus sparingly during discussions, and when she did, her tone was always sharp, her feedback unnecessarily critical. During group activities, she would linger near his table, scrutinizing his work more closely than that of his peers. One day she assigned an essay on the causes of World War I. Marcus spent hours crafting his argument, carefully citing his sources and structuring his points. He was proud of the finished product and felt confident when he turned it in. When the graded essays were returned, Marcus eagerly flipped to the last page to see his grade. A large red C dash stared back at him. Beneath it, Ms. Holloway had written, "Weak analysis. Lacks depth." Marcus was stunned. He had poured so much effort into the essay, and he couldn't understand how she had reached that conclusion. After class he approached her desk, clutching his paper. "Ms. Holloway," he began cautiously, "could you explain where I went wrong on the essay? I'd like to improve for next time." She barely glanced up from her stack of papers. "Your arguments were surface level," she said curtly. "You need to dig deeper. Could you give me an example of what I could have done differently?" Marcus pressed, hoping for constructive feedback. Ms. Holloway sighed, clearly irritated. "I don't have time to go over every little detail, Marcus. Just try harder next time." The dismissal stung. Marcus nodded and walked away, his confidence shaken. It wasn't just the grades or the dismissive comments that wore on Marcus. It was the subtle, constant reminders that Ms. Holloway didn't see him as her equal. She often made snide remarks under her breath, just loud enough for him to hear. During a group project, Marcus suggested an idea for how their presentation could incorporate primary sources. One of his groupmates praised the idea, but Ms. Holloway overheard and interjected. "Don't get too ambitious, Marcus. Focus on doing the basics right first." Her tone was cutting, and Marcus could feel his classmates growing uncomfortable. As the weeks passed, the tension between them became more palpable. Ms. Holloway's gaze would linger on Marcus during lectures, her eyes cold and critical. She would call attention to minor mistakes he made, things she overlooked in other students. One day, during a discussion about civil rights, Marcus raised his hand to share his thoughts on the role of grassroots movements in driving change. Before he could finish his point, Ms. Holloway interrupted. "Let's hear from someone who actually understands the material," she said, calling on another student. Marcus lowered his hand slowly, his heart sinking. The other student gave a hesitant response, and Ms. Holloway praised it, even though it was less insightful than what Marcus had been trying to say. The classroom dynamic began to shift. Marcus noticed that some of his classmates avoided making eye contact with him during discussions, as though they didn't want to draw Ms. Holloway's attention. Others whispered words of encouragement after class, telling him, "I don't know why she's so hard on you." But no one spoke up in the moment. The fear of being targeted by Ms. Holloway was too strong. For Marcus, the classroom began to feel like a battlefield. He walked into room 204 each morning, bracing himself for the next confrontation, the next dismissive comment. His love for history, a subject he had once been passionate about, started to wane under the weight of her hostility. Still, Marcus refused to give up. He doubled down on his efforts, spending extra hours studying and preparing for class. He hoped that if he worked hard enough, he could win Ms. Holloway's respect. But no matter how much effort he put in, it never seemed to be enough. The breaking point came during a parent-teacher conference. Mr. Johnson, as the principal, made a point to visit each classroom and speak with the teachers about how the year was progressing. When he stopped by Ms. Holloway's room, she greeted him with a polite smile, but Marcus could sense the tension beneath it. After exchanging pleasantries, Mr. Johnson asked, "How's Marcus doing in your class?" "He's been working really hard." Ms. Holloway hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. "He's doing fine," she said, her tone neutral but clipped. "But I think he could benefit from focusing more on the fundamentals. Sometimes he tries to take on more than he can handle." Marcus felt his stomach drop. He knew her words weren't just a critique of his work, they were a reflection of her underlying prejudice. Mr. Johnson raised an eyebrow but didn't press the issue. Instead, he nodded and moved on to the next classroom. Later that evening, Marcus replayed the conversation in his mind. He couldn't understand why Ms. Holloway seemed to have it out for him. He had done nothing to deserve her animosity, yet it seemed like everything he did only reinforced her belief that he didn't belong. Over the next few weeks, Marcus began to notice the cracks in Ms. Holloway's facade. She maintained her air of professionalism around other teachers and parents, but in the classroom her true colors showed. When she thought no one was paying attention, her tone would grow sharper, her comments more cutting. During a lesson on systemic inequality, she made a pointed remark that left Marcus feeling exposed. "Some people like to blame the system for their failures," she said, glancing in Marcus' direction. "But the truth is, success comes to those who work for it." The implication was clear, and Marcus could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. Despite the growing tension, Marcus refused to let Ms. Holloway break his spirit. He channeled his frustration into his studies, determined to prove her wrong. But no matter how much effort he put in, it felt like he was fighting a battle he couldn't win. Little did Ms. Holloway know, Marcus wasn't just another student. He was the principal's son, and her actions were about to come under scrutiny in ways she hadn't anticipated. The tension in Ms. Holloway's classroom had been brewing for weeks, but it reached a boiling point during a pivotal class discussion on civil rights. The topic was one that Marcus had always found deeply inspiring. He admired the courage of leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X, people who stood firm against injustice and changed the course of history. It was a topic he had spent hours reading about in his free time, and he felt confident in his understanding. As Ms. Holloway began the discussion, Marcus sat at his desk, listening intently as she introduced the subject. "The civil rights movement wasn't just about marching in the streets," she said, pacing at the front of the room. "It was about strategy, sacrifice, and long-term impact. Now, let's discuss the different approaches taken by civil rights leaders and how effective they were." Marcus raised his hand, his heart beating with anticipation. This was his chance to contribute to the conversation, to share his thoughts on a subject he cared deeply about. Ms. Holloway glanced around the room, her eyes landing on him. For a moment it seemed like she might call on someone else, but she finally said, "All right, Marcus. Let's hear it." He cleared his throat and began. "I think one of the most powerful aspects of the civil rights movement was how leaders like Dr. King used nonviolent protest to challenge systemic injustice. It showed that you could fight back without resorting to the same kind of violence being used against you. It inspired global movements." "Let's hear from someone who actually understands history," Ms. Holloway interrupted, her voice cutting through his sentence like a blade. The classroom fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned toward Marcus, whose cheeks burned with humiliation. He blinked, his mouth still half open, unsure of how to respond. Ms. Holloway didn't stop there. "Nonviolence is a surface-level observation, Marcus," she continued, her tone dripping with condescension. "You're oversimplifying a very complex issue. Maybe next time, spend a little more time studying before you speak." Marcus swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. He nodded silently, his voice trapped somewhere between his heart and his throat. The rest of the class moved on as if nothing had happened, but Marcus couldn't focus. His thoughts raced, replaying the moment over and over. He had read so much about the civil rights movement. He did understand the material. So why had she dismissed him like that? The incident marked a turning point, not just for Marcus but for the entire class. It was now painfully clear to everyone that Ms. Holloway was singling him out. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Her unfair treatment extended beyond her comments during class. Marcus began noticing that his assignments were graded more harshly than those of his peers. It started with a group project on historical revolutions. Marcus had been assigned to work with two other students, Sarah and Daniel, on a presentation about the Haitian Revolution. Marcus took the lead, diving into research and carefully crafting his portion of the slides. On presentation day, their group delivered a cohesive and engaging talk, earning praise from their classmates. When the grades came back, however, Marcus was shocked to see that he had been given a B-, while Sarah and Daniel received A's. At the bottom of his grading sheet, Ms. Holloway had written, "Lacks originality. Relies too much on surface-level analysis." Confused, Marcus compared his portion of the work to his groupmates. It was clear that his contribution was just as strong, if not stronger, than theirs. He decided to ask Ms. Holloway about it after class. "Ms. Holloway," he said cautiously, holding his graded sheet. "I was wondering if you could help me understand why I got a B on the group project. I worked really hard on it and I want to improve." She barely looked up from her desk. "Your analysis wasn't as deep as it could have been," she said curtly. "I thought I supported my points with strong evidence," Marcus said, trying to keep his tone respectful. "Could you point out specific areas where I fell short?" Ms. Holloway sighed, her expression one of exasperation. "Marcus, if you want better grades, work harder. It's as simple as that." The conversation left Marcus feeling defeated. He walked out of the classroom, gripping his paper tightly. He had always prided himself on his work ethic, But Ms. Holloway made him feel like his efforts were meaningless. The comments turned personal as the weeks went on. During a discussion about economic systems, Marcus raised his hand to offer his perspective on wealth inequality. As he started speaking, Ms. Holloway rolled her eyes and said, "Here we go again." The comment wasn't loud enough for the entire class to hear, but Marcus caught it, and so did the students sitting near him. A few of them exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke up. Another day, during a lesson on the Reconstruction era, Marcus asked a question about the economic impact of sharecropping. Ms. Holloway sighed audibly and said, "Maybe you should stick to simpler questions, Marcus. This might be a little over your head." Her words stung like a slap. Marcus felt his chest tighten, but he forced himself to stay calm. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing him upset. But the breaking point came when Ms. Holloway made a comment that cut deeper than any of her previous remarks. It was a quiet Tuesday morning, and the class was working on individual assignments. Marcus was reviewing his notes when Ms. Holloway walked past his desk. She paused, glancing down at his notebook, and muttered under her breath, "People like you never really amount to much." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Marcus froze, his pen hovering over the page. He turned to look at her, but she had already moved on, acting as if nothing had happened. For a moment, Marcus felt paralyzed. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. It wasn't just an insult, it was an attack on his identity, his potential, his worth. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Marcus went through the motions of his classes, but his mind was elsewhere. That evening, as he sat at his desk at home, he replayed the moment over and over. He wanted to tell someone, his father, a counselor, a friend, but he hesitated. Would they believe him? Ms. Holloway was respected by the administration and feared by her students. Who would take his side against hers? As the days went on, Marcus began to withdraw. He spoke less in class, afraid of drawing Ms. Holloway's ire. His once active participation dwindled to near silence. He stopped volunteering answers, stopped asking questions. His classmates noticed the change. Sarah, who had worked with him on the Haitian Revolution project, tried to encourage him. "Don't let her get to you," she said one day after class. "You're one of the smartest people I know." Marcus forced a smile but didn't respond. It was hard to explain the weight he felt every time he walked into room 204. Even outside of class, the stress began to take a toll. Marcus found himself staying up late, reworking assignments to make sure there were no mistakes Ms. Holloway could use against him. His grades, once a source of pride, began to slip under the pressure. The one place he found solace was in his father's encouragement. Mr. Johnson often asked Marcus how school was going, and Marcus would give vague answers, not wanting to worry him. But one evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Mr. Johnson noticed the exhaustion in his son's eyes. "Marcus," he said gently, "is everything okay? You've been quiet lately." Marcus hesitated, debating whether to share the truth. Finally he said, "It's just, school is harder than I thought it would be. I'm trying my best, but it feels like it's never enough." His father nodded, his expression understanding. "I know it can be tough, but you're capable of more than you realize. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Marcus felt a lump in his throat. He nodded, grateful for his father's words but unsure if they were enough to help him face Ms. Holloway again. The escalation in Ms. Holloway's behavior had reached a point where Marcus knew he couldn't stay silent forever. But for now he endured, hoping that if he worked hard enough she might finally see his potential. What Marcus didn't realize was that her prejudice ran deeper than he could have imagined, and the battle he faced was far from over. The tension in Ms. Holloway's classroom had been building for weeks, and Marcus felt the weight of it more every day. Her sharp comments, dismissive tone, and unfair grading were bad enough, but the subtle jabs and loaded remarks cut deeper. It was as though every interaction was a test of how much he could endure. Marcus tried to keep his head down and focus on his work, but he couldn't shake the growing sense that no matter what he did, it would never be enough. One morning, as the class prepared to turn in a written assignment on major economic revolutions, Marcus sat at his desk, meticulously reviewing his work one last time. He had spent hours researching and writing, determined to meet Ms. Holloway's standards. "All right, everyone," Ms. Holloway said, her voice commanding the room as she walked to the front. "Pass your papers forward." The students obeyed, the rustling of pages breaking the silence. Marcus handed his paper to the student in front of him and exhaled, feeling a small sense of relief. The rest of the period was spent in quiet work, with Ms. Holloway occasionally glancing up from her desk to scan the room. Marcus was deep into his reading when her voice suddenly broke the calm. "Marcus," she said, her tone sharp. He looked up, confused. "Yes, ma'am?" "Come here," she said, waving a piece of paper in her hand, his paper. The room fell silent as Marcus stood and walked to her desk, every eye following him. "What is this?" she asked, holding up the assignment. "My paper," Marcus said carefully. "And you expect me to believe that you wrote this?" Her tone was icy, her words laced with accusation. Marcus blinked, stunned. "Yes, ma'am. I worked on it all weekend." Miss Holloway scoffed, shaking her head. "It's obvious someone like you couldn't come up with this on your own." Her words hit like a physical blow. The classroom was so quiet that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Miss Holloway turned to the rest of the class, her voice carrying authority. "Plagiarism is a serious offense," she said. "If anyone thinks they can cheat their way through my class, they're mistaken." The students exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke up, but their discomfort was palpable. "I didn't cheat," Marcus finally said, his voice shaking but firm. "I wrote every word." Miss Holloway stared at him, her expression unmoving. "We'll see about that," she said. "Sit down." Marcus walked back to his desk, his head low. His classmates avoided his gaze, and the weight of the humiliation pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. The rest of the class passed in a haze. Marcus could barely focus, his mind replaying the moment over and over. He knew he hadn't cheated, his work was his own. But Miss Holloway's words lingered, seeding doubt and anger in equal measure. When the bell rang, Marcus remained in his seat as the other students filed out. "Marcus," Miss Holloway said, not looking up from her papers. "If you're going to waste my time, make it quick." He stood and approached her desk, his hands trembling slightly. "Miss Holloway," he began, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat, "I don't understand why you're treating me like this." She finally looked up, her expression unreadable. "What are you talking about?" "You accused me of copying," Marcus said. "You've been unfair to me since day one. I work hard, but nothing I do seems to be good enough for you. I don't understand." Miss Holloway leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a faint, almost mocking smile. "If you can't handle the pressure, Marcus, maybe this isn't the right school for you." Her words were like a punch to the gut. Marcus stared at her, searching her face for any sign of regret or reconsideration, but there was none. She dismissed him with a flick of her hand. "You're excused." He walked out of the room, his chest heavy with frustration and hurt. For the first time he felt truly defeated. That evening at dinner, Marcus sat across from his father, who was going through some papers from the school. Mr. Johnson glanced up and noticed the distant look on his son's face. "Long day?" he asked, offering a warm smile. Marcus hesitated. He had been keeping Miss Holloway's behavior to himself, not wanting to cause trouble or seem like he couldn't handle it. But today's incident had pushed him to the edge. "Yeah," Marcus said finally. "Actually, Dad, there's something I need to talk to you about." Mr. Johnson set his papers aside and leaned forward, his expression serious. "What's going on?" Marcus took a deep breath. "It's my history teacher, Miss Holloway. I don't know how to explain it, but she's really unfair to me. She's always calling me out, grading me harder than everyone else, and today she accused me of cheating on an assignment." Mr. Johnson's brows furrowed. "Accused you? What did she say?" "She said it was obvious someone like me couldn't have written it," Marcus said, his voice quieter now. His father's jaw tightened. "Did she actually say that?" Marcus nodded but chose his next words carefully. "She didn't say anything directly about my race, but it's hard not to feel like that's part of it. She's been targeting me since the first day." Mr. Johnson sat back in his chair, his face a mix of concern and anger. "Marcus, I had no idea this was happening. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I thought I could handle it," Marcus admitted. "I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. But today, I don't know. It just feels like no matter what I do, she's always going to see me as less." Mr. Johnson was silent for a moment, processing his son's words. "I believe you," he said finally, his voice firm. "And I'm going to look into this. But I need to handle it carefully. If I act too quickly, it might look like favoritism. Let me gather more information first." Marcus nodded, appreciating his father's calm and measured approach. But deep down he felt a lingering doubt. Would anything really change? Over the next few days, Marcus tried to keep his head down and avoid drawing Miss Holloway's attention. But her words lingered in his mind, eroding his confidence with every passing hour. The classroom, once a place where he felt inspired, had become a source of dread. Despite his efforts, the incident with the assignment spread quickly through the school. Whispers followed Marcus in the hallways, students speculating about what had happened. Some avoided him, not wanting to get involved. Others offered quiet words of encouragement when Ms. Holloway wasn't around. "You didn't deserve that," Sarah, one of his classmates, said after history class one day. "Everyone knows you work hard. Don't let her get to you." Marcus forced a small smile, but her words felt hollow. It wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about surviving in an environment that felt increasingly hostile. Mr. Johnson, true to his word, began investigating the situation. He spoke to other teachers, asking subtle questions about Ms. Holloway's behavior. He reviewed Marcus' assignments, comparing them to his classmates' work to see if there were discrepancies in grading. But as the principal, he knew that taking action against a teacher, especially one with a strong reputation like Ms. Holloway, required solid evidence. He couldn't rely solely on Marcus' account, no matter how much he believed his son. One evening, after another long day, Marcus came home to find his father waiting in the living room. "Marcus," Mr. Johnson said, motioning for him to sit. "I've been looking into your concerns about Ms. Holloway." "And?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with both hope and apprehension. "She's a respected teacher," Mr. Johnson began, choosing his words carefully. "But that doesn't mean she's above scrutiny. I've spoken to a few students and teachers who've noticed some inconsistencies in her behavior." Marcus nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I want you to know that I'm taking this seriously," his father said. "But I need you to trust me to handle it the right way. Can you do that?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded again. "I trust you, Dad." Though he appreciated his father's support, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. Every time he walked into Ms. Holloway's classroom, he felt the weight of her scrutiny, the sting of her words echoing in his mind. Her latest comment, "Maybe this isn't the right school for you," replayed in his head like a taunt. He had worked so hard to get to Crestwood to prove he belonged. But Ms. Holloway had planted a seed of doubt that was growing stronger with each passing day. For Marcus, the breaking point wasn't just about a single moment of humiliation. It was the culmination of weeks of feeling unseen, unvalued, and powerless. And while he didn't know it yet, his struggle was about to come to light in a way that would change everything. The day of the civil rights presentation arrived, and Marcus walked into room 204 with a mixture of determination and anxiety. He had spent days preparing, researching every detail, and crafting a speech that he hoped would not only meet Ms. Holloway's impossibly high standards but also prove to himself that he deserved his place at Crestwood High. He clutched his notes tightly as he took his seat, glancing around the room. His classmates sat quietly, the usual tension in the air heavier than ever. Even those who hadn't spoken out against Ms. Holloway's treatment of Marcus had begun to notice her pattern of behavior. Whispers had circulated about her sharp remarks and unfair grading, and though no one had confronted her directly, Marcus could feel the undercurrent of unease among his peers. Ms. Holloway entered the room promptly, her presence commanding as always. She didn't greet the class but instead began writing the day's agenda on the board. "Presentations start today," she announced without turning around. "This will count for a significant portion of your grade, so I expect nothing but your best." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus felt his chest tighten. He had rehearsed his presentation countless times, but he knew that no amount of preparation could shield him from Ms. Holloway's scrutiny. "Marcus," she said, her tone curt, "you're up first." He stood slowly, gathering his notes, and made his way to the front of the room. As he arranged his materials, he glanced at his classmates. Sarah offered him a small, encouraging nod, and he took a deep breath. Marcus began his presentation, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. He spoke about the courage and strategies of civil rights leaders, focusing on figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Ella Baker. He highlighted their different approaches to fighting injustice, emphasizing the importance of both grassroots movements and national leadership. The room was silent as he spoke, his classmates listening intently. Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment he could prove himself. But halfway through his speech, Ms. Holloway interrupted. "That's enough about King," she said abruptly, her tone dismissive. "We've all heard that before. What else do you have?" Marcus paused, startled, but pressed on. He shifted to discussing Ella Baker's work in organizing communities and empowering young activists. "I think Baker's emphasis on grassroots movements shows how." "Marcus," Ms. Holloway interrupted again, this time with a sigh. "You're missing the bigger picture. You're focusing too much on minor details and not enough on the overall impact. Can you move on, please?" The words hit him like a slap, but Marcus forced himself to continue. He spoke about Malcolm X's philosophy of self-defense and his transformation later in life, tying it back to the broader goals of the movement. When he finally finished, he looked up, his heart pounding. For a moment there was silence. Then Miss Holloway smirked. "Maybe next time stick to something you actually understand," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and Marcus felt the sting of humiliation all over again. He stared at the floor, his fists clenched at his sides. But this time the silence didn't last. "That's not fair." Sarah's voice cut through the tension, startling everyone in the room. Marcus looked up, his eyes wide. Sarah, who had always been quiet and reserved, was standing up in her seat, her face flushed with anger. "Marcus did an amazing job," she said firmly. "You keep cutting him off and acting like nothing he says is good enough. It's not right." A murmur spread through the class as other students began to nod in agreement. "Yeah, he worked really hard on that," Daniel added, his voice hesitant but growing stronger. "You didn't even let him finish some of his points?" Miss Holloway's expression hardened. "This is my classroom," she said sharply, her voice rising. "If you don't like how I run it, feel free to leave." The room fell silent again, but the damage was done. The students' murmurs of agreement had shifted the balance of power, and Miss Holloway's usual authority seemed to falter. Marcus, emboldened by his classmates' support, took a step forward. "Maybe the principal should hear how you talk to students like me," he said, his voice steady but pointed. Miss Holloway froze, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" she asked, though her tone betrayed her discomfort. Marcus met her gaze, his voice unwavering. "You know who my dad is," he said simply. "Principal Johnson." The color drained from Miss Holloway's face. For a moment, she looked like she was trying to calculate her next move, but the room was already against her. The silence in the classroom was deafening, the weight of Marcus' words sinking in for everyone present. Miss Holloway's usually confident demeanor faltered as she realized the implications of what Marcus had just said. "Marcus," she began, her tone strained. "I think you're misunderstanding." "I'm not misunderstanding anything," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm. He wasn't going to let her deflect or dismiss him this time. "You've been treating me unfairly since day one. And now everyone here knows it." Miss Holloway opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, Sarah spoke up again. "He's right," Sarah said, her voice filled with conviction. "You've been targeting him all semester. We've all seen it." The murmurs grew louder, other students chiming in to agree. "It's not just Marcus," another student added. "You're always harder on him than anyone else." Miss Holloway's composure cracked further. "That's enough," she snapped, her voice rising. "This is a classroom, not a debate club. Sit down, all of you." But her authority had already been undermined. The students didn't stop murmuring, their discontent palpable. Marcus stood tall, refusing to back down. "I think it's time someone held you accountable," he said, his voice calm but resolute. Miss Holloway glared at him, her face a mixture of anger and panic. For the first time, the power dynamic in the room had shifted, and she was no longer in control. After class, Marcus walked out of room 204 feeling a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. The confrontation had taken everything he had, but he knew it was necessary. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the school. By the time Marcus reached the principal's office later that day, his father was already waiting for him. "Marcus," Mr. Johnson said, his expression serious but tinged with concern. "I heard about what happened in Miss Holloway's class." Marcus nodded, his shoulders tense. "I couldn't stay quiet anymore, Dad," he said. "She's been treating me like this all semester. I had to stand up for myself." Mr. Johnson placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said. "And now it's my turn to handle this." For Marcus, the moment of revelation was both a turning point and a victory. He had faced Miss Holloway's prejudice head-on and found the strength to speak his truth. With his father's support and his classmates by his side, he knew that the fight for accountability wasn't over, but he was no longer facing it alone. The day after Marcus' confrontation with Miss Holloway, the incident was the talk of Crestwood High. Students whispered in hallways, teachers exchanged concerned glances, and the weight of what had happened seemed to hang in the air. Marcus had gone to bed the previous night feeling both exhausted and uncertain, but he knew that the truth was finally out in the open. By mid-morning, word had reached Principal Johnson. At first he was informed of a disruption in Miss Holloway's class, but as the details became clearer, a much darker picture emerged. When Marcus entered his father's office during lunch, Mr. Johnson's usual warm demeanor was replaced with a stern focus. "Marcus," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I've been hearing a lot about what happened in Miss Holloway's class yesterday. I need you to tell me everything. Marcus hesitated for a moment, unsure of where to start. But then, as if a dam had broken, the words poured out. He told his father everything, every degrading comment, every time Ms. Holloway had dismissed his efforts, every unfair grade and public humiliation. She said things like, "People like you never amount to much," Marcus said, his voice shaking as he recalled the most painful moments. "She's been targeting me since the first day, Dad. And it's not just me. She does it in front of the whole class. They see it too." Mr. Johnson's face darkened as he listened, his hands clenching into fists on the desk. "Marcus," he said finally, "I had no idea it was this bad. I'm so sorry you've been dealing with this alone." "I didn't know if anyone would believe me," Marcus admitted. "She's respected here. But yesterday, the other students stood up for me. They've seen it too." Mr. Johnson nodded, his resolve hardening. "This ends now," he said. "I'm calling an immediate meeting with Ms. Holloway. You've been brave, Marcus, and now it's my turn to make sure this is handled properly." By that afternoon, Ms. Holloway was sitting in Mr. Johnson's office, her usual confidence noticeably absent. She had heard the whispers spreading through the school and knew the meeting wasn't going to be a routine check-in. Mr. Johnson sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable, while Marcus sat in a chair off to the side. The air was thick with tension. "Ms. Holloway," Mr. Johnson began, his tone even but firm, "I've received troubling reports about your conduct in the classroom, particularly regarding your treatment of my son." Ms. Holloway stiffened, her eyes darting to Marcus before quickly returning to Mr. Johnson. "Principal Johnson, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice carefully measured. "I hold all of my students to high standards. If Marcus felt I was being unfair, it was never my intention." Mr. Johnson raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "Because from what I've heard, this goes far beyond holding students to high standards. Marcus has shared instances of belittling comments, unwarranted accusations, and a pattern of singling him out in class." Ms. Holloway's face flushed. "I've been teaching for over a decade," she said defensively. "I've always pushed my students to succeed. If Marcus took my feedback personally, that's unfortunate, but I assure you, I treat all my students equally." Before she could continue, Mr. Johnson held up a hand. "I've spoken to multiple students from your class," he said, his voice cutting through her excuses. "Their accounts confirm a consistent pattern of behavior toward Marcus that cannot be ignored." He reached for a folder on his desk and opened it, revealing typed statements from several of Marcus' classmates. "Sarah, Daniel, and others have described your actions in detail," he said, sliding one of the papers across the desk. Ms. Holloway glanced at the paper but didn't touch it. Her confidence was starting to falter. "Your words, 'People like you never amount to much,' were witnessed by more than one student," Mr. Johnson continued. "Do you deny saying that?" Ms. Holloway's mouth opened and closed as she struggled for a response. "I don't recall saying that specifically," she finally said. "But, if I did, it was taken out of context." "There is no acceptable context for a statement like that," Mr. Johnson replied, his voice rising slightly. "Your role as an educator is to uplift and inspire your students, not tear them down. Your behavior has been harmful, discriminatory, and completely unacceptable." As the confrontation continued, Ms. Holloway's defenses crumbled. Faced with the mounting evidence and the testimonies of her own students, she had little room to maneuver. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I've been too harsh at times, but I didn't realize—" "Intent doesn't erase impact," Mr. Johnson interrupted. "The damage has been done. And as principal, it's my responsibility to ensure that every student at this school feels safe and respected in their learning environment. That clearly hasn't been the case in your classroom." Ms. Holloway looked down, her hands trembling slightly. "Effective immediately," Mr. Johnson said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "you are suspended pending a formal investigation. The school board will be informed, and we will review all available evidence before determining the next steps." Word of Ms. Holloway's suspension spread quickly, and the school community reacted with a mix of relief and shock. For years she had been a respected teacher, but her actions toward Marcus had revealed a side of her that many found troubling. The administration wasted no time in addressing the broader issues raised by the incident. Under Mr. Johnson's leadership, Crestwood High implemented new policies to ensure that teachers were held accountable for their actions. Mandatory diversity and inclusion training was introduced for all faculty and staff, aimed at fostering a more equitable and supportive environment. A new reporting system was also established, allowing students to anonymously report concerns about teacher behavior without fear of retaliation. For Marcus, these changes were a small but significant victory. While they couldn't erase the pain of what he had endured, they ensured that no other student would have to face the same treatment. As the weeks went on, the investigation into Ms. Holloway's conduct deepened. Additional testimonies from former students came to light, revealing a troubling pattern of behavior that extended beyond Marcus. It became clear that her prejudices had been simmering beneath the surface for years, shielded by her reputation and the fear of those she targeted. Ultimately, Ms. Holloway submitted her resignation, unable to recover from the backlash of her actions. In her resignation letter, she acknowledged her mistakes and expressed regret, though many questioned the sincerity of her words. For Marcus, her departure marked the end of a painful chapter. But it also served as a reminder of the power of speaking up and standing firm in the face of adversity. The school year continued, and Marcus began to regain his confidence. With Ms. Holloway gone, his classroom experience transformed. He found support and encouragement from other teachers, and his grades rebounded as he once again poured himself into his studies. On the last day of school, as Marcus walked across the stage at the end-of-year awards ceremony, he felt a surge of pride. His classmates cheered loudly, their applause a testament to the strength and resilience he had shown throughout the year. Mr. Johnson watched from the audience, his heart swelling with pride. As Marcus accepted his award for academic excellence, their eyes met, and they shared a small, knowing smile. It wasn't just a victory for Marcus, it was a victory for everyone who had stood by him, for the classmates who had spoken up, and for the community that had rallied to make Crestwood High a better place. In the end, Marcus' story became a powerful lesson about courage, accountability, and the importance of standing up for what is right, no matter how daunting the challenge may seem. The weeks following Ms. Holloway's resignation marked a new chapter for Marcus and Crestwood High. For the first time in months, Marcus felt like he could breathe freely. The shadow that had hung over him was gone, and in its place was a sense of hope. But Marcus knew his journey wasn't just about moving on. He wanted to make sure that no one else would ever have to face the kind of treatment he had endured. One day Marcus was called to his father's office. Mr. Johnson greeted him with a warm smile, a rare break from the seriousness of the past few weeks. "Marcus," he said, motioning for him to sit, "we're holding a school assembly next week to address everything that's happened. I think it would mean a lot if you spoke." Marcus hesitated. "Me? What would I even say?" "Just tell your story," Mr. Johnson said gently. "The students and staff need to hear it. You've already shown so much courage. This is your chance to inspire real change." Marcus considered the idea. The thought of standing in front of the entire school was daunting, but he knew it was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. "Okay," he said, his voice steady. "I'll do it." The day of the assembly came quickly, and the gymnasium was packed with students, teachers, and parents. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of anticipation and reflection. Mr. Johnson stepped to the podium first, his voice calm but commanding. "Today we take an important step forward," he said. "We've faced challenges, but those challenges have brought us closer together as a community. And no one embodies that spirit more than Marcus. Please welcome him." The applause was thunderous as Marcus walked to the podium, holding his speech tightly in his hands. He looked out at the sea of faces, took a deep breath, and began. "When I came to Crestwood High," he said, his voice steady, "I was excited. I wanted to learn, to grow, to become the best version of myself. But I never expected that I'd have to fight for the right to be treated fairly, to be seen as equal." The room fell silent as Marcus recounted his experiences. The subtle jabs, the overt insults, the moments of doubt that had chipped away at his confidence. But he also spoke of the strength he found in his classmates' support, the courage it took to speak up, and the hope that came from seeing change take root. "It's not enough to say we believe in equality," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. "We have to live it. No one should ever feel less than because of who they are. And no one should have to fight alone to be treated with respect." When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Students cheered, teachers wiped away tears, and Marcus felt a swell of pride. For the first time he understood the power of his voice, not just for himself but for others who might be struggling in silence. The assembly was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Crestwood High implemented a series of changes aimed at creating a safer, more inclusive environment. Diversity and inclusion training became mandatory for all faculty and staff, and the school established a student advisory council to ensure that all voices were heard. Marcus was invited to join the council, where he worked with his peers to shape policies that promoted fairness and accountability. The student body also began to transform. Marcus' story had ignited conversations about equality and respect, and students who had once stayed silent began speaking up when they witnessed injustice. The culture at Crestwood High shifted, becoming one of unity and support. For Marcus, these changes were a small but significant victory. His confidence, once shaken, was fully restored. He excelled in his studies, his grades climbing back to the top of the class. His teachers, inspired by his resilience, encouraged him at every turn. The bond between Marcus and his father also deepened. Mr. Johnson, who had always been proud of his son, now admired him on a whole new level. They spent evenings discussing not just school but broader issues of justice and leadership. "You're going to change the world someday," Mr. Johnson told him one evening. Marcus smiled. "Maybe," he said. "But right now I'm just trying to change this school." Graduation day arrived and the gymnasium was once again packed, this time with students in caps and gowns, families holding cameras, and teachers beaming with pride. Marcus stood among his classmates, his heart pounding with excitement. As the ceremony progressed, Mr. Johnson took the stage to announce the recipient of the Academic Excellence Award. "This year," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "the award goes to a student who has not only excelled academically but has also shown extraordinary courage and leadership. He has made our school a better place for everyone, and I couldn't be prouder to present this award to my son, Marcus Johnson." The gym erupted in cheers as Marcus walked to the stage, his heart pounding. He accepted the plaque from his father, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared pride and understanding. As Marcus turned to face the audience, he saw the faces of his classmates, cheering louder than anyone else. Sarah and Daniel stood near the front, their smiles wide, and Marcus felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Looking out at the crowd, he realized how far he had come, not just as a student but as a person. He had faced adversity, stood up to injustice, and emerged stronger. And in doing so, he had helped pave the way for a better future at Crestwood High. As the ceremony ended and students threw their caps into the air, Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. He had grown, learned, and become a voice for change. If Marcus' story moved you, let it be a reminder that your voice matters. Standing up against injustice isn't easy, but it's necessary. Together, we can create a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to hear more stories like this. And let us know your thoughts in the comments below, because every voice counts and every action brings us closer to a better future.